Well, yeah. Hello, Professor Caputo. I'm personally a very, very big fan of you. I probably read almost all your books at this stage.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've seen your name on my Facebook page many times, and I appreciate your interest in my work.
Thank you.
So maybe before we start, we're going to introduce you. Even though we don't need to introduce you, but yeah, just for some formally that and some information to share to all the participants. So Prof. Caputo here is a philosopher and a theologian at the Thomas J. Watson Professor of Religion Emeritus at Syracuse University, and David R. Cook Professor of Philosophy at Emeritus at Villanova University. So he already wrote dozens of books and maybe a lot of articles about Christianity, specifically associated with postmodern Christianity and continental philosophy and with theology. Maybe we're going to talk about it later. But for now, I think that's, you want to add something more, Prof. Caputo?
Yeah, that's all true.
Yeah. Maybe before we want to talk about your book, Prof. Caputo, we want to ask a bit about yourself. So what makes you into theology and philosophy? Is there any specific events that makes you want to pursue studies and even becoming a scholar in theology and philosophy?
Well, I think it's autobiographical. I mean, I think that, as you can see in that book, I started out my life in a very religious world. And I was drawn into a Catholic religious order, the La Salle brothers, and had intended to spend my life as in a Catholic religious order. And it was in that context that I discovered philosophy, because we were being trained to become religion teachers, but we also, in order to understand theology in the Catholic tradition, you really need to know philosophy. So I studied quite a great bit of Thomas Aquinas back in the 1950s and 60s, and gradually my interest in philosophy overtook my interest in theology, and but I never left the theological orientation behind. So I always, although my formal training was in philosophy, and most of my life I spent teaching in a philosophy department, my real interest was in the questions surrounding religion and theology. So at a certain point, I just simply ended up doing what we call in the university the philosophy of religion. But it was more than that. It wasn't simply philosophy of religion. It was really more of a philosophical theology. My subject matter wasn't precisely religion. It was God and the questions of human destiny that religion is about. So it was, but that involved talking about religion too, of course. So it was a matter of what Heidegger calls facticity, where you find yourself when you wake up in the world, and I woke up in a very Catholic religious world, and my views have evolved from that starting point, but that starting point is always with you. You never leave it behind. You're just sort of reenacting it and revising it and repeating it in various ways, but it never you can't leave it behind, no more than you could leave your native language behind. So that's how I got started, and that's how I ended up where I am.
Yeah.
And to make a long story short.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Caputo. Can you share a bit about what is philosophy or theology for you? Like, what kind of thing it is?
Well, it's not science. It's not. You're dealing with measurable quantities and mathematical equations, and you can't formalize the knowledge that you seek in philosophy or theology. And it's very closely tied up with experience, your concrete experience, and I would even say imagination. I mean, there are different kinds of philosophy, right? And so in the Anglo-American world, the dominant kind of philosophy is more closely associated with science and mathematics, and so it seeks to formalize language, and it seeks propositional knowledge, which has its place. But this brand of philosophy that interests me is French and German philosophy, what we call continental philosophy, which is concerned with the structure of experience and the questions of the ultimate desire and ultimate meaning. And so it tends to deal with matters that are not propositional. I mean, one needs to use propositions and arguments, concepts, propositions, and arguments to speak about something which is not ultimately a matter of concepts, propositions, and arguments, but has to do with what you might call the deep structure of human experience, questions of value, meaning, purpose. So traditionally, as you speak philosophy as a science of ultimate causes, well, the word causality is maybe not the best word anymore, because when you start talking about causes, you're more likely to be talking in scientific terms. But you could say philosophy is an inquiry into ultimate meaning and ultimate significance, ultimate purpose. But it has to do with something ultimate, the ground of things, the depth of things, and consequently, it's not as closely related to science as it is to the other humanities, to literature and history and art. It's you might say its cousin, its close relative is not the mathematical sciences, but the humanities, the other humanities.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Caputo. And a bit context. I grew up in analytic philosophy, and on the other hand, Angga's a very continental-minded philosopher. So sometimes we had a lot of differing opinions, and I actually learned a lot about you from Angga. So yeah, I wanna hand over to Angga for the next questions.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Because I think my internet is not so good. Okay. So maybe we will beginning to enter our questions about your book. But first, before we start, because not everyone has already read or know about you. How would you explain yourself in a nutshell? Although I know you don't like to put yourself in a nutshell, it's difficult to put something in a nutshell. But I believe popular definitions wouldn't be sufficient to explain your position, but at least trying to give some outline so people can understand a bit before we go into the depth of your books.
Well, I am a continental, let's say a continental philosophical theologian. Put that, you could put all those words in one pile. A continentally oriented, philosophically trained, the philosopher who was thinking about questions of surrounding God, religion, God, and religion, God, theology, the whole sphere of the religious. And if I had the philosopher who has had the deepest importance for me is Derrida and deconstruction, but that should be accepted as part of the tradition. Goes back to phenomenology and hermeneutics. So hermeneutics, phenomenology, deconstruction. If you sort of triangulate them, I'm in the middle of them philosophically. Theologically, the theologian who makes the most sense to me, who I draw upon, is Tillich. Although I think that Tillich's position is metaphysical. Nonetheless, I think that some version of Tillich is where I'm headed philosophically and theologically. And Tillich, you would say, is a post-theist. So, which is a position I would take, post-theistic. That is, it represents a critique of classical Orthodox theism. So about that theism, I am an atheist. The word atheism is relative. It depends upon what you mean by theos, right? The ancient Greeks, the Athenians, accused Socrates of being an atheist because he didn't think the sun and the moon were gods. The Romans accused the Christians of being atheists because the only God they believed in was their own, and they rejected all the other gods. So they thought these people were basically atheists. So atheism is a function of what you mean by God. And I am an atheist about the God of theism because I think that God is not the supreme being, but something much more like what Tillich calls the ground of being. So, which I think is a phenomenon. Ultimately, he regards it as an ontological idea. I regard it as a phenomenological idea, which goes back to when St. Paul was at the Areopagus and he referred to the Greek poet who spoke of God as that in which we live and move and have our being in Acts 17. So I think God is much more like that than God is the supreme, supernatural, extraterrestrial being. That classical theist God I reject, and I'm more interested in a more concretely embedded phenomenological, experiential notion of God. So Tillich, Derrida, kind of philosophy, the question of the ground of being. That's a post-theistic idea of God and religion. That's sort of my philosophical terrain.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember about that part that you brought up earlier about that you're an atheist about is a specific kind of God, which is the God of classical theism. So yeah, I think it's discuss on in the book and in your first chapter.
That's right.
Yeah, right. When you state
That's where I start.
that God does not exist, and it's a very quote unquote controversial for a lot of people. Maybe they will be questioning like, okay, he's a theologian, but why does he start the book with a statement that God does not exist? Would you mind to elaborate more a bit about your statement that God does not exist?
Well, for one thing, I'm trying to get your attention, right? I want you to read that so that you'll read the next page, and then the next page to read the whole thing. So part of it is just being impudent, and I was going to use the word snarky, but I'm not sure you know this word snarky. But that's it. Part of it is just being impudent, but the other part of it is completely serious, and that is that the view is post-theistic. I mean, I think the classical notion of God is anthropocentric. It is it treats the ground of being as if it were somebody. Now, I don't, as I try to say in this book, I don't dismiss that completely. It's an act of personification. Now, personification is not a bad thing, right? I mean, we personify, when something is very important to us, we personify. So you might have an old family memento, an old clock, an old watch, an old hat that belonged to someone who is now dead, but who was very precious and important to you. And you would talk to that. You would personify that and think out loud and have a, when nobody else is around, have a conversation with this object. Or you can do that. People do that with animals, or with a favorite tree or plant, or any object has a depth of significance to you. You would personify. So in the book, I make reference to St. Francis's canticle to the sun and the moon, which he called brother sun and sister moon, and he addresses that. So that's absolutely fine. That's a completely valid and important use of personification. And I think that that's what classical religion is, that it is classical theism. I think classical theism is personifying a depth of existence, a depth in being, what Tully calls the ground of being. And as long as one understands that that's a personification, then I think it's harmless. It's valuable. But when you do, but if you take it in some literal sense, the way classical theism does, you raise all kinds of crazy questions, I think. And then you start, I mean, for example, you get into the problem of evil. Why is this person up there not behaving the way we would expect or hope? Why does this person allow evil? And then we personify. The personification also gets us into the questions of eternal rewards and eternal punishments, because if we don't make this person happy, he'll punish us. He'll become the wrath of God, the anger of God is the wrath and anger of this person. Well, that I think is mythological thinking. I think that is taking that literally like that, I think is mythology. So I say that does not exist. And then to make it clear that I mean that I put the thing in Gothic, a Gothic font. You notice in the book that the word gods will sometimes appear in the Gothic font, and that's to signify I mean that God. I don't mean God in every sense. I mean that one, which I consider to be a mythological expression. So when I say God does not exist, I'm saying that does not exist. Another way I'll put it is I'll sometimes say God does not exist, God insists, meaning that the name of God is the name of a call. It's a name in which we have concentrated everything that we think is important, and we take it to be an address that is breaking in on our lives and asking us to, trying to get our attention and trying to make us respond to matters of ultimate concern. So it's a kind of personification of matters of ultimate concern that calls upon us, summons us. So God does not exist, God insists, in which case the existence of God is up to us. It lies in the response to what's being called in the name of God. So, I think, I think that the New Testament's notion of the kingdom of God is a very good example of something that when we read it, we come under its sway. We come under the power of this, what I think is a summons or call. And making when we ask the kingdom to come, the coming of the kingdom is up to us. We're the ones that have to make it happen. And then, in that sense, God will exist. So the God. So when I say God does not exist, I'm in part I'm being a smart aleck, and in part I'm making a very serious proposal.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Caputo. So a little context of my own background. So what drives me to read your book is because I'm struggling with a lot of questions. So yeah, like what I said before, I'm actually doing analytic philosophy, and I'm dealing with questions such as God's hiddenness that provided by Schellenberg, or the problem of evil, and many problems. And yeah, I could say that I almost becoming an atheist, I guess. So I'm looking for for a lot of alternatives, and again, that's how Anga wrote me this book, this What to Believe. So I'm starting to exploring radical theology. Now, maybe Anga, you have some questions about this?
I'm very glad to hear all that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yes, yeah, we share the same struggles about classical theists, because we both come from a traditional conservative reform evangelical background, which actually very similar from your experience, because I actually read your book, the one Hoping Against Hope, and I feel like it's very, very relatable, your experience from your traditions and when you grow up. But yeah, maybe because what you explained would actually touch the issue of two groups of people that you wrote in your book, that you classify one groups as bridge builders and the others as ground diggers. Could you care to elaborate more? From what I know, then my upbringing supposed to be the ground diggers and maybe also the wall builders, the one that burned the bridges.
Well, it's, if you want to see what I'm talking about in a completely straightforward way, or academic way, or professional way, then you would look at this essay by Paul Tillich called "The Two Types of Philosophy of Religion," which is in a book called "The Theology of Culture." So you have the book, you've read the book, so you see those references to Tillich's theology of culture. And Tillich makes this distinction between the ontological and the cosmological approaches to God. And that's what I'm talking about. In the cosmological approach to God, and this he associates with Thomas Aquinas, and it goes back to Aristotle. We begin with a sensible world around us, and then we try to deduce from that world the necessity of some being that is created the world, that is the first cause of the world. So we try to build a bridge, like the Golden Gate behind you in your picture. We try to build a bridge over to this supreme being from on the basis of our world. So we try to move from the finite to the infinite on the basis of the finite. And basically the principle of causality. It's basically the only way to build it. The thing that holds that bridge up is the principle of causality. So I call them the bridge builders. The other approach, and Tillich calls it the cosmological approach, because it starts with the sensible given world, the physical world, cosmos. The other approach, which I call the ground diggers, is what Tillich is calling the ontological approach, where God is not a supreme being on the other side, but God is the ground of being. God is that in which we live and move and have our being, which is in the Acts of the Apostles, but it's in a text where Paul is quoting a Greek philosopher by the name of Epimenides, who said that God is that in which we live and move and have our being. So the way Tillich will put it is, he'll say, and this is the difference between the two. In the one case, God is a supreme being. In the other case, in the ontological or ground digging way, God is being itself. In the one approach, God is the highest thing we can know. In the other approach, God is the light in which we can know anything. In the one approach, God is the supreme good. In the other approach, God is goodness itself. In the one approach, God is a supremely powerful being. In the other approach, God is the power of being itself. So, and then they'll quote from St. Augustine, who says, don't go out and about and abroad looking for God. God is already here. So it's a theory of the radical immanence of the divine being, which it's not a matter of going out and finding it, but of realizing that you're already in it. It's not a matter of searching for the highest truth. It's understanding that we live and move and have our being in truth, the light of truth. We wouldn't be able to. God is the light in which we search for truth. He's not a particular true truth or particular true being. So it's a question of recovering what we already have, discovering something we already possess, remembering something we already know. So it has that kind of function, rather than looking for something other. So God is not wholly other. God is that in which we live and move and have our being. So it's a question of ground digging means penetrating the experience we already have of living in this divine milieu or matrix. Bridge building is treating God as a something other that we have somehow or another to find some way of getting to. And since we can't do that, then God has to break in and reveal himself in some supernatural revelation, which is Karl Barth. So the difference between ground diggers and bridge builders is the difference between Paul Tillich and Karl Barth. it's the difference between the cosmological and the ontological. And it's also the difference between a phenomenological approach, which is sensitive to the depths of our experience, and a metaphysical discursive argument or proof of a foreign of a distant being, like a distant galaxy. So one very nice way that Tillich has of putting all this, which is the point I'm making, is we may be alienated from God, but God is not an alien being. We may be alienated from God, but God is not an alien being. And so the discourse, the religious search, and the discourse of theology ought to consist in probing the depths of our experience rather than trying to establish the existence of this supreme being, which is, I profoundly, deeply, sincerely think, a mythological way of thinking about God. I think it belongs to an ancient cosmology, right? When you say, look up to God, people look up. Well, if you look up and I look up right now, you and me, and on pretty much almost the opposite sides of the world, we're looking in different directions, right? It's people in the north are looking one way, and people in the south are looking. It's a pre-modern imaginary, and it imagines it goes back to a pre-modern cosmology where there was the first heavens that you can see, and then there were various strata of heavens beyond that, and God was in the very highest of the heavens. So God on high, the highest of in the heights of in the celestial heights. All of that belongs to a pre-modern cosmology. It's a completely mythological way of understanding the world. And we understand the world profoundly differently now. I mean, it has almost nothing to do with all of that. And I mean, if anything now, the German theologian Rudolf Otto spoke of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, right? This awe-inspiring, tremendous mystery. I think that you could make a very good case that this incomprehensible universe that we live in which our planet is a tiny little dot, that's the mysterium tremendum. That's the we everybody who is reflective anyway understands that human life is fragile, that we live our time on earth is short. Derrida likes to say life will have always been too short, and that we are part of something much larger, something vast. And in classical times, in pre-modern times, it was natural to say that's the infinite God, it's infinite being, that one way up there in the heavens beyond, the seventh heaven, who is responsible for all this. But now we understand that that's the incomprehensible vastness to which we belong is the universe, which may be just one of many universes. And there may be multiple universes. There may be an infinite succession of universes. And the universe is really quite mysterious. As you get into quantum physics, you begin to understand how deeply paradoxical reality is. So I think that religion has to grow up. It has always had a cosmological. Theology always takes place against the background of a given cosmology, and the scriptures. Now, I love the scriptures. I love the New Testament, The scriptures belong to a different cosmological world. And they were saying something deeply important, but you don't want to mix up the deeply important things they were saying with the cosmology and the mythology and the sort of mystification. You need to understand them as profoundly important literary documents, the way you think about Shakespeare or Greek tragedy or any classical piece of literature. So that's what's behind the distinction between ground digging and bridge building. I said for a while, so I was trying to write this book for people who weren't necessarily trained theologians. Now, I've gotten various reactions to it. Just got an email last night that said, "You failed. It's too philosophical. It's too theological. It doesn't reach the general public." And I haven't responded to that yet, but I'm going to say, well, that's the best I can do. I mean, this was an attempt to put this into non-technical language. If I failed, then I just can't do that. This is as best I can do in putting this into making it available to a general audience.
Yeah, I just want to share a bit of good news. My wife is not a theologian, and she has no degree in theology, but she learns a lot from your book. So yeah, good news. Yeah.
Okay.
She read it first.
That gives me something to say to this guy who just wrote to me last night. I'm going to tell him about your wife.
Yeah, this is like the most accessible book that you've ever, for me personally, reading a lot of your books. Every time people ask me quite recently, I will always like, just read this first. This is like the easiest way to get some understanding about what you want to try to give people.
Well, that's the goal. Another one that's sort of like this is On Religion, particularly the first edition of On Religion. And that I really worked hard to get that down to non-technical language. Hoping Against Hope is a little bit like that. The most of the books that I publish with university presses are meant to be academic books for specialists, for people for graduate students and professors and college students. The books that are not published with academic presses are meant to be more general. This one actually is with an academic press. Columbia University Press is an outstanding academic press, but they were interested in it because they said that they thought they wanted a book that would sort of take what we do in the academic world and get it out there, put it into plain language, and that's. And I sent it to a number of people who were not academics, and I asked them to read it and criticize it, and I got a lot of good feedback from them saying they didn't understand this and they didn't understand that, and so I would rewrite. And I kept rewriting it so that it would, because what we're talking about, people should be able to understand. You don't have to put it in the language of the university. The language of the university has its place. I don't want to dismiss that, but what we're talking about can be put into simpler language in the same way. Like I just made a reference to quantum physics. I'm really deeply interested in quantum physics and what's going and contemporary cosmology. Scientists, and I don't understand the math, but there are people who know how to explain what the big ideas are there, right? And that's what I was trying to do in this book. Put this stuff into a language that non-specialists can understand. And we'll find out whether I succeeded or not. But so far, it's the most of the reaction to it has been clear that they understand it. Second half of the book seems to be a little harder than the first half, but The first half, nobody's complaining about the first half. Second half, some people have said they're not quite sure what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and precisely that's the second part is the one that I'm going to ask about next. I think it's hard, more like it's hard to swallow, I guess, because in the seventh chapter, because we start with the classical teas, then you go to the, I would say, I don't know, canon teas or maybe process. But in the next chapter, because you try to, this is what I like from all your books, you are engaging with the recent scientific findings, and you are talking about how, according to science that we know, at least up until today, the universe will be going to nothingness, and you talk about everything is mortal, even God, if you can say God, is not exempt from that reality. Um, could you share your perspective on that, about that, and how should we approach this finitude, this mortality, about the whole universe?
Okay, so let's suppose that we agree with the panentheists or the process theologians that God is not a transcendent being. God is a grounded being. God is the depth of reality. God is the divine. So it makes, in some ways, it makes more sense to say not God, but the divine. The divine depth of being is not transcendent, it's immanent. It's not some other world, it's this world. Okay, let's agree. For the sake of the discussion, let's agree about that. Well, then what do you do with the fact that most scientists, not no, scientists don't agree about everything. You know, they argue as much as philosophers and theologians do. But the common opinion right now, the most widely received opinion right now, is that the universe is expanding. And it's not only expanding, it's expanding at an increasingly accelerating rate. So it's expanding faster and faster. And dark energy, and matter, which constitute 94% of the universe, is pushing it out farther and farther, faster and faster. And we have every reason to think that this is just going to go on. There's no particular. Maybe it won't. You know, maybe tomorrow morning somebody will discover something that'll change our minds. But at the moment, we expect these scientists, not me. I don't. You know, I'm not prepared to argue this. These scientists say, but this appears to be where it's at. And then at a certain point, you won't be able to see the sun from or the stars. You won't be able to see the stars from the Earth. They'll be so far away we won't be able to see them. And then the sun will devolve into a white dwarf. Energy will be consumed. The second law of thermodynamics will set in. And the end result is that even atomic particles will break up. And things will be not in a state of absolute nothingness, but in a state of used up, spent, dead energy. Now, we just said that God is Deus sive natura, right? God or nature. God is the immanent power, the immanent ground of being. For as best we can tell right now, the ground of being is headed for dissipation and breakup. So then natura, when you say Deus sive natura, natura is heading for a state of de naturata. So it's going to just be broken up. And it'll be just spent, useless, dead, cold, lifeless, lightless, dark, almost nothing. What happens to what is the response of panentheism to that? Well, the panentheists can't come along and say, "Oh, well, that can't happen. This is the divine being. This is Deus. Deus sive et God wouldn't let that happen." We say, "Well, how do you know?" Uh, so, what I say is, let's just suppose that that's the case. Then I think that what that shows is that what we mean by God is not unconditional being, because there is no unconditional being. It looks like we're heading for entropic dissipation. What we mean by God is not unconditional being, but the unconditional value or worth of being. And the mortality that would befall or beset the universe makes the moment we have, this cosmic moment which we have here on earth, all the more precious. In just the way that mortality intensifies love. The image that I always go to in this context is, in just the way that lovers who know that they must part in the morning cling to each other all the more tightly in the night. The mortality intensifies love, doesn't undermine it. When you marry, you say, "Until death do us part." It's built into the vow. I think you can make a very good case that if things were that immortal beings cannot love because they can't put anything at risk. Love is a risk. Love is a sacrifice. Love is an unconditional commitment to the other. Come what may to me. And an immortal being can't take a risk, is invulnerable. So I think, in fact, St. Augustine says we can only love things that last forever. I think it's exactly the opposite, which is the truth. That the things we love the most intensely are transient and mortal. Only mortals can love. Love is a power that mortals have to cling to life. So what would be true for us as human beings in human relationships and human love would then be true for the universe itself. And the precious moment we have here, Carl Sagan's thing about the pale blue dot, which I refer to, makes this little globe of ours and this short amount of time in cosmic terms, because the universe will go on for trillions of years, and the little space of time that we occupy is like a blip, a moment, makes that all the more precious, and it should make us all the more attentive to protecting the planet and dealing kindly with one another to nourish life. God is love, the fourth gospel says. And love is mortal, I think. And so the name of God, not the name of a supreme being, it's not even the name of eternal being. It's the name of what is infinitely valuable, infinitely, unconditionally worthy of love. It's not an ontological name, I say, but an axiological name. So the first half of the book, it shows that we must make the move if we want to find out what we really believe, from the cosmological to the ontological, from God as a supreme being to God as being itself. Second half of the book is meant to show that we must make a second step from the ontological to the axiological, or if you want to be a smart aleck like Jacques Derrida, you could say the hauntological, from ontology to hauntology. But that's the argument. So what is it that we really believe? What do we really believe? You know, I believe in a being, some kind of supreme being. What we believe in is we believe in love. We should not. There's a passage in this book that I really like personally, and it's the beginning of one of the last chapters where I say, you shouldn't love what you believe. You should believe what you love. And so what we really believe is in love and in the value of in matters of unconditional worth. We believe in love. We believe in justice. We believe in peace, beauty. Those are things that we love unconditionally, without why, as Meister Eckhart said. Love is without why. So this shows up in the tradition. That's why I say in this book there's an inside-outside relationship. I'm criticizing theism, but I'm saying that criticism is there in the inside, within the tradition itself. If you look in the tradition, there are all kinds of radical thinkers in the tradition who say things like this. And one of my favorites is Meister Eckhart. So one of the things that came up in the Middle Ages was a kind of, you might call it the dilemma of love. And Meister Eckhart said, he's a great preacher, and he was also a bit of a smart aleck. He said, some men love God the way they love their cow for its milk, right? And so he meant some people, they love God because they're afraid of going to hell, and they want eternal happiness. So that's not really, that's like having a very temperamental parent whom you better stay on their good side, because if you don't, you're going to be sorry, right? So this notion of an eternal reward or versus an eternal punishment, because they sort of go hand in hand, undermines the idea of love. So Meister Eckhart says love has to be without why. You love something unconditionally, not because it's a good investment. It's not, love is not transactional, we say today. So he said, he made this hypothesis, and it was just a hypothesis because he didn't think this could happen, but he made the hypothesis that if God's will were that he, Meister Eckhart, this good Dominican friar who led a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, that if God's will were that he should go to hell rather than come to heaven, then he would prefer to live in hell, in God, separated from God, if that's what God wanted, because his love of God was a love of God, and whatever God wanted. So it was an impossible hypothesis, right? He didn't think that God could actually do such a thing, but he was trying to separate the notion of love from some kind of reward. You love something for itself, for its own unconditional worth, not because you can get something from it, something else. So that's the way I think about this question of mortality, and even the mortality of the cosmos itself. what we mean by God is a matter of unconditional love, unconditional worth, unconditional value. This axios in the Greek sense of what's something that is intrinsically worthy of respect and honor and love. We don't mean the supreme being, and we don't even mean being itself. So that's the point where I separate myself even from Paul Tillich, whom I love. I mean, I think Tillich is the sort of breakthrough figure. Actually, Tillich goes back to the German idealists, but if you've ever tried to read the German idealists, I mean, you have to be a specialist. You have to know German. You have to be dedicated to reading some very difficult books. But it's all back there in German idealism. And they, I think they made the great breakthrough, which is about the immanence of God, which they called the Geist, the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, the Weltgeist, the spirit of the world, the immanent power of the divine in the world. Tillich picked that up from, he was a specialist in the work of Schelling, and he sort of brought all that into New York City and started teaching it in English, and it got, and so you had him on the one side, and then Whitehead on the Anglo-American side, and you get these two sources of radical theology from Tillich on the one hand, Whitehead the other. I draw more heavily from the continental tradition, even though I'm an American and English-speaking American. You'd think I would be drawn to Whitehead. But the continental philosophers were always more important to me. There you go. So anyway, that's why I introduced this cosmological hypothesis. And even if, tomorrow morning, some young physicist comes up with a theory about dark energy that blows all this up, and the theory changes, it will still be the case that our world, our universe, our solar system, our galaxy, there may be multiple universes. That's one answer to this. But it would still be the case that our universe would come to an end. And unless you'd have a dualist Platonist theory of the world, where there's some kind of sphere outside of space and time, which I think is philosophically unjustified and theologically a matter of myth, then you have to admit that the world, on almost any account that we know, is passing away. So it's a good test case that the business of the expansion of the universe is an interesting test case for what we really believe in. Look, suppose they say that some of, I don't think any of the stars that are visible to us with a naked eye or that this is true of them, but there are stars whose light can be detected, but long after the star itself went out of existence, right? So we have evidence of stars, and we see the light of stars that no longer exist. They're so far away, the light has finally reached us long after they went out of existence, burnt out. All right, now suppose one of those stars had a planet that was in a sweet spot that produced life, intelligent life, and a civilization and a culture and some idea of what's true and good and beautiful, and it all disappeared, gone. Would we say that was worthless, meaningless, absurd? Why? Why would you say that? It was finite. It didn't last forever. But matters of unconditional value, worth, beauty, truth were there for a while. The rose is without why. It blossoms because it blossoms. It asks not who sees it, cares not who loves it. It's here for the while, and then it's not. That doesn't mean it's not a matter of unconditional worth and value and depth. Okay. So that's what I think we actually what we really believe is that. And that's what's beneath the various sorts of beliefs that belong to the various religious traditions. That's what's underneath it. That's what's fueling it. So I don't think that religious assertions, religious creeds, let's say creeds, correspond to facts of the matter out there in the world. I don't think that's the case. I think that those creeds are propositions that are trying to formulate and clarify in a symbolic way what we really believe. So I think that religious traditions are basically symbols, what Tully calls symbols. And symbols are important, right? People kill one another over symbols. Tully says, two things about symbols you should remember. One is, if you understand what a symbol is, you'll never say only a symbol. And the other is, never confuse a symbol with what it's the symbol of. And what we really believe is what the symbol is a symbol of, not the symbol. Literalism, fundamentalism, evangelicalism, conservative Catholicism are confusing a symbol with what the symbol is a symbol of. They're confusing a book with what we're talking about, or they're confusing an institution with what we're talking about. And that's a kind of idolatry, right? You could say the one grave sin in religion and theology is idolatry, and that idolatry consists in confusing the symbol with what the symbol is symbolizing. And what we really believe in is not the symbol, but what the symbol is symbolizing, which is matters of unconditional worth and value and depth and beauty, truth.
So I like the way you put it into words. Like, all panentheism can do is cheer lip, keep its metaphysical fingers crossed, and hope that maybe ours is just one of the infinite multiplicity of endless universe, world without end. Amen. And you add, that might save God, but it would not save us. So I really love the way you put it into words. So my question's about God, Prof. Caputo. So not only that universe will collapse, but God will be disappeared. So this will be our last questions. So in light of these concepts, what purpose or meaning do we find in our existence? You already talked a bit actually about that, but how should we navigate our existence in a world where, as Karamazov famously stated, if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted. So yeah, what do you think about it? What left for us if one day God will be?
Yeah, that's what I was just saying to Anka. It's getting over. You might think put it this way: it's getting over means end thinking, transactional thinking. That we don't want, that we value something only because of something else that we can get back, like an investment in a stock exchange. Stop thinking like that and begin to revere the world for itself and in itself, and human communities in and for themselves, and this planet in and for itself, rather than thinking of the world and life as a trial, at the end of which the Son of Man will come on a cloud and judge the nations, which is a terrifying, pathological way to think about the world, as if there is some immensely powerful figure who's going to come, is coming to get you if you don't keep the rules. It's a terrifying, pathological, infantile way to think about the world. So think about life. God is love. God is life. God is the ground of being. God is the world. The depth of being in the world. And our task is to make ourselves worthy of what is going on in the name of God, which is this call for, I have come to bring good news to the poor and the lame and the blind and the imprisoned. That's what he was talking about. That was the kingdom. When the kingdom comes, then that will be good news for the blind and the lame and the imprisoned and the poor. That's what's going on in the name of God. It's not a trial. It's at the end of which we're going to find out whether we win or lose. It's to be treasured in and for itself, without why, as the mystics say. Love is without why. So it is at the very far extreme from nihilism. It's a theory of the intrinsic but mortal value of human life and of our world. And so what is the meaning? The meaning of life is internal to life itself. It's not something outside life. It's not like, here's life, and then if you use it right, you're going to get something in reward. Well, what would that be other than more life? Life is, it's not so much that there's a meaning of life as there is meaning in life. That life is meaning. Life is the meaning. So if you think about what purpose is there in life, the purpose of life is to revere life for itself. The purpose of life is intrinsic to life. It's not something beyond it. What's the purpose of saving up money for retirement? Well, so that you can use the money when you retire. Life is not like that. Life is not, it's not an investment. It's not a savings account. It's intrinsically valuable in itself and of itself. And this man, Gilles Deleuze, is another philosopher I like a lot, has this point where he said, this remark where he says, ethics means to make yourself worthy of the events that happen to you. To make yourself worthy of the events that happen to you. That's I mean, if someone, the Psalms say, why, O Lord, do the wicked flourish and the just go down, go on? Of course they can. They have the power and they have the money, and for the most part, they can get with it. They always have. They always will. But there's something intrinsically dishonorable about that. In itself, of itself. The value of life is not to dishonor yourself, not to dishonor life. Right? And that's intrinsic to life. It's not something such that if you do it, you'll get rewarded. Right? Yeah, the reward is life. Life is not a trial for which you're going to be rewarded or punished. The reward is life itself. The gift of life is itself.
Professor, but thank you. I actually I quite agree a lot and internalize what you explained about life and everything, but I have one question. And this is bugging me, and I'm struggling with it, about the reality of people who live life in immense suffering. For example, if we see the case in Palestine, I wonder how would this way of thinking would relate for people in immense suffering. I know it's not a hopeless life, but for people in immense suffering, sometimes praying to the big other, to the God who will settle everything, would give comfort. What do you think about that?
If it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone who would not get the conversation we're having right now, who wouldn't quite understand all that, who never heard of Paul Tillich or any of this stuff, I would say leave them alone. Let them enact their life like that if it gives them hope. I don't think this is for everybody. I think that a lot of people lead lives, simple lives, without sophistication, and they lead decent lives. And leave them alone. It's when these things become vitriolic, when they become invidious, when they become violent, that we need to intervene. As to the existence of violence in the world, which is irreducible. I mean, we are given to violence. That's just a fact of biological, sociological life. Requires people. I mean, this kind of thinking. I don't mean to say that this kind of thinking should inspire any kind of quietism. This globe, fragile planet, and this fragile life, and we should. It's infinitely precious, and we should protect it, and we should nourish activism and nonviolence, and we should find a way to translate love and justice and sovereignty. That's why I wrote a book called The Weakness of God, to break down this notion of sovereign power and to think in terms of communality and nonviolent, shared, not against power, but shared power, the multiplication of power, so the dissemination of power, as opposed to a single power source, an omnipotent being who's coming to get you if you don't watch yourself. So I think that the notion, this way of thinking about God has a much more, it's much more on the side of birth, life, emergence, commonality, community, communitarian, nonviolent action, not power down. It's not power down. The bridge builders are trying to get to the sovereign power up there, and so the power comes down from the top down from top to bottom. The way I'm thinking about religion and theology and God is from the bottom up, from the eminent ground of being, and then which we treasure for itself and try to nourish for itself. So there would be an ethics and a politics that goes along with this. But it would not be patriarchal. It would not be organized around the concept of sovereignty and sovereign power and the delegation of sovereign power to the proxies and the stand-ins for the sovereign power who think they have who confuse themselves with sovereign power. So theocracies start war. Pantheism doesn't start wars.
Is it okay if we still ask some more questions from the audience, or is it too long for you?
Well, how about we do one more question, because we're heading on to an hour and a half, which is A little
quite
bit long, but that's one. Let's take one more question.
Okay. I have difficulty to decide questions, but probably I will ask this one because I feel like why you choose Christianity would be because of your Catholicity, because you simply born in the Catholic traditions. But so I will ask this one: theology and cosmological model. How much we should intertwine our theology with the current understanding of the cosmos, especially aside from several basic laws. There is massive uncertainty in the nature of our understanding of the universe. I have concern that by intertwining theology with the uncertain, unclear, incomprehensible, it causes theology to be decoupled with the natural reality that people experience.
Okay, I didn't get every single word there, but first of all, I think that theology and cosmology, theology and science, theology and our knowledge of the world around us belong hand in glove. They absolutely cannot be separated from each other at the risk of ignorance and mythology. If you look at the history of theology, the history of theology is a series of movements, all of which, every one of which, makes a cosmological presupposition. It assumes a state of the natural world, and it builds upon that. It draws upon that. It's built into our language, our culture, our imaginary. And if theology or philosophy falls out of step with our understanding of the nature of the physical universe, it does so at its own risk. It's making itself obsolete if it does that. I think right now the task of what I like to call the theologian to come, the theologians of the future, is to come to grips with artificial intelligence, which is beginning to break down the distinctions that classical theology has drawn upon. The distinction between matter and spirit, body and soul, human and non-human, living and non-living. Those distinctions are breaking down. And the more we discover about biology and physics and chemistry and cosmology, the more porous those distinctions become. And theological reflection can't bury its head in the sand and ignore that. The war between religion and science is destructive. And the loser is going to be religion. That is not a war that religion wants to engage in, because it's going to lose. It is losing. It is losing. It already, Christian nationalists in the United States, evangelists, right-wing conservative religion, is making itself unbelievable. It's confining itself to an uneducated, undereducated, narrow little world of people living under a veil of ignorance. And it's making it in the United States and in Western Europe generally, there is a correspondence between being educated and having a loss of religious belief on the one hand, and being uneducated and being very, very religious. The religion is becoming more and more the province of the undereducated, the uneducated. And that's lethal. So I the people that I have a colleague at Villanova University right now, a woman named Ilia Delio, who was a Franciscan nun who has a PhD in pharmacology, and she's interested in brain science, and she's very interested in artificial intelligence. And she's looking for ways in which artificial intelligence can universal, worldwide, global community, which is a goal of religion, global peace, global community. That's the kind of theologian that we need in the future. Theology in the future has to be scientifically literate, and so does philosophy. So I think it's destructive, self-destructive of religion and theology to try to say there's just two different spheres. There's heaven and the heavens. There's religion and there's science, as if they were different things. They're not different. They're complementary. They should be complementary. They should go hand in hand. And specifically informed at every step of the way about contemporary cosmology. And actually, it's interesting. There's interesting stuff going on there. When you look at quantum physics, you say, well, religious people believe some crazy things, but so do the scientists. I mean, superposition and quantum entanglement and all those things. It's an amazing world. So whereas the kind of science that seemed so bitterly opposed to religion was mechanistic Newtonian science. Contemporary science is if you're looking for the mystery of life, study quantum physics. You'll have plenty of mystery if you want to, if you in view of science, which hasn't been around for a long time now. Well, I mean, it is, and it hasn't been falsified. But it was the Newtonian conception of science itself, a determinist world, which pitted science and religion against it. Science and religion were not opposed in the Middle Ages. I mean, the Aristotelians in the 13th century were very interested in the natural world. Albertus Magnus was had a great interest in natural world and in what we would call biology. The universities are Christian medieval inventions, right? So it's not until Galileo and modern Newtonian science that the two of them began to make war on each other, and the war is rooted in a misunderstanding. Religion's misunderstanding of itself and its own supernaturalism, and science's misunderstanding of itself as reductionistic and naturalistic reductionism. Science is not reductionistic rationalism. It's not reductionism. It's completely, the great scientists are completely baffled by what's going on in the universe. And they think that 94% of the universe is in the dark, right? And religion has to get over its supernaturalism. It's this fiction that it's got some kind of supernatural revelation that dropped down out of heaven and fell in its lap. If it gets over that, and science gets over its reductionism, then the two belong together. And they do belong together. They always work together. And so anyway, that's what I think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Caputo, like an hour and a half. So let me try to end the discussion with a quotation from your book. So I'm gonna read it directly from the book. So at the end of a great film, as the credits roll down the screen, do you demand your money back because it did not last forever? At the end of a beautiful song, do you applaud or do you complain that it is over? Is that the meaning of the sister death? So then, why did the string quartet on the Titanic continue to play? They were applauding. They were saying by playing. Playing in order to say yes, hallelujah. This is what life has been. A beautiful moment in the cosmic music of the spheres. Yes, a shooting star, a flicker of glory. Beautiful, but brief. Beautiful, because brief. Not everlasting life, not everlasting great glory, but a more difficult glory, sadly ending, but beautifully blending with sadness. Yes, yes, amen, hallelujah. So, and just like life will be end someday, this discussion must be ended. So, yeah, it's really an honor for us, Prof. Caputo, for you to talk to us, Indonesian theologians and philosophy enthusiasts. So, yeah, we're really grateful for this experience.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for reading this book so well. You all obviously understand it very well, and I appreciate your encouragement because I now have the courage to answer this email I got last night about this person complaining that I didn't make things clear. So anyway, thank you all very much. Keep up the great work. What you're doing, this kind of stuff is very important, and I encourage you to keep on keeping on, as we say.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Caputo.
much.
Bye.
We'll see you again.
Yeah, bye.
Hopefully.
Okay, that would be fine. I'll
Bye.
be glad to do this again sometime. Yes, good. Bye-bye.